There is this phrase, know thyself. Socrates said this, and many a person today on YouTube or talk shows says the same thing. Know yourself, know your worth. And yet, there are those, alternatively, sometimes in book form, with PhDs even, who say worth is utterly relative. It's utterly in the eye of the beholder. And this one author with a PhD degree has said, additionally, who's even qualified to assess the gradations of worth? In other words, if you take a coin collection, for instance, and try and have it appraised, who's qualified to really do a good job of appraising the quality of a coin's condition? There are various gradings, but who's most qualified to do so? Likewise, there's a dating coach of some notoriety who has a video out on how to grade women from 1 to 10 and apply a number value. I haven't watched the video, but an interesting concept. In a sense, too, we can be talking about how you best measure happiness. You might say, what is your yardstick for measuring happiness? Is it your monetary holdings? Is it the person who dies with the most toys? That phrase. Is happiness accorded to the person with the most power, you might measure, in conventional terms today, or the most beauty as we often think of it from the Hollywood approach? Or is happiness to the person most who lives the longest, physically speaking, regardless of their emotional condition or level of awareness, shall we say? Some saying that many are half awake since mid-childhood, having lost their joy. Others measure things by whether you consider yourself religious or not, or spiritual or not, or what your values are in general. Yet others measure things, your yardstick, by whether you enjoy spending time more with people, data, or objects. And here's a biggie. What if worth is deemed what most people in a society in a certain time like today enjoy most? For instance, I used to go oftentimes on a Saturday to what they call an art theater. And there were no more than 5 to 15 people there, for most all wonderful, powerfully evocative movies. And yet, at the same time, there were typically, if a football game were playing or basketball game at the local university, 20, 30, 40,000 people perhaps attending. So you might ask, what is the yardstick then for what we call worth? What is worth? Is it just in the eye of the beholder? Now, there are those who say one of the problems inherent in this is that worth has to be quantifiable to be really something of worth. Otherwise, if you can't measure it, it has no value. But then, wouldn't this be contradicted by those who say, love a certain type of marijuana, the most potent, the better? Or for any other chemical drug of choice. Even a glass of alcohol, some enjoying much more than others as to how it was prepared, or the grapes grown, or mash prepared, whatever have you. And yet others not being able to tell the difference between a $5 bottle of wine and a arguably much better, to some people's palate, $500 bottle of wine. Now, I used to have this phrase that I invented, sort of, that everybody can do whatever they want to as long as the wake behind their boat, so to speak, doesn't capsize someone else. So the phrase in my mind being, whatever floats your boat, as long as the wake behind the boat doesn't capsize others. Hence the phrase, perhaps, do whatever you feel like. Now, at least one practitioner once told me when I was seeking advice, let's say 30 years ago or more, do whatever you feel like, just don't get caught. Now, that came from a medical doctor, by the way. But I would say, additionally, here's the question. The question is this. Is something of worth only if it feels good to a person, and thus, arguably, use of chemical substances to excess especially, or other short-term escapes in life? My question then is, what are the long-term impact? Isn't know yourself and know your worth not subjective, not trivial in the sense of what the long-term impact is to both yourself and your society and the world, and even life on planet Earth? Of course, the environment, too, part of that. So maybe our worth is not subjective in terms of how something makes you feel, or how it makes others feel in the short term, but in the long term. For instance, I haven't looked up lately the details of the Philippines, but President Duarte once there declared kind of a state of emergency with regard to chemically based drug addicts. And I won't go into the basis of details more, but he basically gave orders to the police to shoot all drug addicts on sight because he deemed the problem so out of control. Well, couldn't you argue that it started, this out of control situation, if you will, to the extent this was true or not, I don't know, but couldn't you argue that this started as simply a claim that your worth is whatever it feels like to you and others, but only in the short term. And in the long term, you have a more objective, solid sense of worth, real worth, in terms of the long-term outcome to you and everyone else around you and all life forms on the planet. Oh, and I hate to have to digress, but I was talking a minute ago about is worth only something if measurable, tangible in that sense? Well, maybe certain things would be more measurable and tangible if we had terminology. For instance, one woman in England, Vanessa Van Edwards, I believe her name is, who has done some considerable work, has come up with a lot of terminology to label nonverbal communications, both in the face, body language, and your verbal intonations. And she has a fascinating number of terms. If only we were taught such in school regularly through the ages, maybe some things that we claim to be unmeasurable would be suddenly measurable because we have terms. Just like an interior decorator has probably under their belt at least 50 terms to describe colors other than just black and white and gray. Wouldn't that be funny if you invited them over for work and they offered you just 3 colors to paint your walls, white, black, and gray, and saying, well, all the others are unmeasurable because we have no terms. Maybe we need to get going like Vanessa Van Edwards in England and have terms for a whole bunch of more things that we consider presently unmeasurable, because there's no terms that are recognized across the board and practiced. Just like in mathematics, we have terms for digits 0 through 9, and thus many things are measurable by having more complex terminology than simply 0 or 1, as per binary in computer systems. But then, of course, also, I was alluding to the subjective value of a good bud of marijuana versus a not good one. By the way, I've never smoked marijuana. Or, how do you measure a feeling of being well loved, of being well regarded, of being uplifted, of being cared about, of someone going the extra mile for you? How do you measure those as intangibles? We all, I think, have a subjective feeling, but we just can't quantify it. We can't break it down, but that doesn't mean it isn't real as experienced. Or here's a biggie. I was watching a show by the Actors Guild a few days ago about Harrison Ford, his life. And it was brought up that one of his strong characteristics was his strong sense of humility, or rather his humility in general. And it was well regarded that that was a strong trait of his. And some other actors or actresses have the strong trait of understanding people well. A few in particular I would mention. Maybe I'll bring it up at a future point in time who I'm talking about. But to have strong respect for someone or strong humility are very subjective and yet very well perceived, I think, on a subtle level or more than just subtle. Unmeasurable and yet very real. Some would say the most important things, in fact. How do you even measure a good night's sleep? You wake up refreshed. That's unquantifiable, yet everybody wants a good night's sleep. Same with worry, fear, if you call it, or terror even. All unquantifiable, yet we don't want to feel terrified or worried. Same with the love life, so to speak. How are you going to quantify all of that? Number of minutes in bed? I watched a movie once where there was a rabbi, perhaps it was, who measured his sex life by being very punctual about it every Friday night at, say, 7 p.m. Oh, that's very quantifiable, but was that measuring the enjoyment factor or how rigid it was? See what I mean by quantifiable as measuring things? I'd kind of wrap things up then by what I observe in many a talk show host as time goes on for them, or YouTube host, shall we say, sometimes earning considerable amounts of money per day, even in podcasting. I notice I put the word often flash in the pan, that what is regarded in the shorter term as someone of great worth, often to many people, or maybe just more of a niche, but in the short term, often promoting strong drug use or aggressiveness, call it violence, or I call it vigorousness. In the long term, you see that these are, I call flash in the pans, almost inevitably. For those who would take a religious point of view or a more elevated point of view called spiritual point of view, the scripture of Christianity talks of building things on the sand, only to see things washed away later. Or you might call building a house of cards. All of this often short-term expedient, when we might say, well, it feels good, but in the short term. But what about the long term, both to oneself and everyone else? Maybe that's why some say the classics stand the test of time. They otherwise might be considered a flash in the pan in the short term, but what of the long term? What about all the politicians, too, who might get great acclaim in the short term, but go down, so to speak, ignobly in the long term. Now, I'm not going to say that all old philosophers who supposedly stood the test of time are virtuous, when in fact many maybe arguably have only put out a lot of platitudes or buzzwords, as some call them, like love others and be honest and care about others and so on. And if that's not fleshed out and walked the talk of and understood in its complexities, well, the test of time for platitudes doesn't mean much in my book. But at any rate, I think in terms of use of chemical substances for escape, or what they call being charismatic, even a demagogue, what they call the virtues of being aggressive, seems to me in the long term to be a flash in the pan and recognized by history as such. So the question, do we have objective worth, or simply relative worth to whoever is observing it and enjoying it? The question being, in my mind, are we talking short-term value to some or a lot, or long-term value? Are we talking, thus, what feels good in the short term but turns out to be a flash in the pan approach in the long term, with basically long-term consequences we often didn't intend or anticipate or want to acknowledge in the back of our mind at any rate, and pushed out of the way until maybe our deathbed or future generations seeing the folly, shall we say, of such. I again say, what feels good in the short term could be a nation of, quote, drug addicts, hence the book out in print with the title, This Is Your Country, High on Drugs, or another book, Comfortably Numb, and yet another book, Drugging the Poor, all out in print. And I don't have to talk much about environmental concerns, and even the word materialism, as per use of exotic, complex, and ever-changing distractors of choice in my mind, which are very costly. Costly, by the way, not just to the environment to extract them and deliver them and quickly, but also in terms of how they suck up our time, our energies, our focus, and leave us not focusing then on working on infrastructure, working on possible pandemics of the future, working on anything and everything that would advance mankind instead of seeing it degrade in time. To the example then of the Roman Empire, say, or the British, shall we say, their empire later in life, later in mankind. Or look at the Mayan Empire. There are even those who say that if you take only short-term approaches, there could be a civil war coming, or another world war, or nuclear war, or, shall we say, invasion, whether unwarranted or warranted, depending on which point of view you have. All of these going back to how you measure worth, both in the short term and long term. That's my final conclusion. If you're going to say it's all subjective and let everyone do as they feel like, seems that a very short-sighted approach.